One of my favorite things to do during the summer is read, especially when it's in the sunshine and drinking a delicious beverage. And this summer, specifically, my goal is to read 3 teacher books and then 3 fun books, aka not teacher books. And in today's episode, I'm going to be sharing the 3 teacher books that I am going to be reading and why I chose these ones specifically. Let's get started. Welcome to Solving for the Undefined podcast. I'm your host, Johanna, founder of Miss Kuiper's Classroom, the place that equips teachers in creating a healthy math classroom where students can thrive, no matter their academic abilities. But it's not always about the numbers, and that's why I'm here, bringing you the formulas to solve your problems, math and otherwise, plus strategies on cultivating that necessary math mindset. And that's what you can count on. All right, hello, and welcome to episode 35. Today I'm going to be sharing the 3 teacher books that I am going to be reading this summer and why I chose those books. I feel like during the school year, I don't have as much dedicated time to read, so I like to stuff it all in during the summer. I listen to audiobooks in the car, but I typically like to listen to fun books over educational books when I'm driving, just because it holds my attention a little bit more. Plus, I feel like the audio version of an educational nonfiction book is not going to be very exciting to listen to. So the first book that I chose for my teacher reading list this summer is Teaching with Poverty in Mind by Eric Jensen. Now, I believe back in episode 29, that is the episode where I talked about 5 ways to engage all of your students. And a lot of the ways that I talked about came from Eric Jensen's other book, Engaging Students with Poverty in Mind. I am a Title I teacher, or I work in a Title I school. And this means that the majority of the students that come to our school, their families are lower income or below the poverty line. And research shows that the way students' brains work when they come from a poverty background is going to be different than someone who comes from a middle class or upper class world. And this book, Teaching with Poverty in Mind, addresses a couple of things that are going to help me when I'm teaching this demographic of students. I'm going to read you the back cover of the book because that's going to give you a better synopsis than what I could explain to you. In Teaching with Poverty in Mind, What Being Poor Does to Kids' Brains and What Schools Can Do About It, veteran educator and brain expert Eric Jensen takes an unflinching look at how poverty hurts children, family, and communities across the United States and demonstrates how schools can improve the academic achievement and life readiness of economically disadvantaged students. Jensen argues that although chronic exposure to poverty can result in detrimental changes to the brain's very ability to adapt from experience means that poor children can also experience emotional, social, and academic success. Drawing from research, experience, and real school success stories, Teaching with Poverty in Mind reveals what poverty is and how it affects students in school, what drives change both at a macro level within schools and districts and at the micro level inside a student's brain, effective strategies from those who have succeeded and ways to replicate those best practices at your own school, and how to engage the resources necessary to make change happen. Too often, we talk about change while maintaining a culture of excuses. We can do better. Although no magic bullet can offset the grave challenges faced daily by disadvantaged students, this timely resource shines a spotlight on what matters most, providing an inspiring and practical guide for enriching the minds and lives of all your students. Now, before I move into the second book that I'm going to be reading this summer, I just had an idea and I'm not sure how I feel about it, but it would be really cool to do a book study on one or more of these books. So if that is something that you would be interested in, please let me know. I think I'll do a poll on my Instagram and see if there's interest there as well. But I think this book that I just talked about, or one of the 2 that I'm going to be talking about next, would be really cool books to do a book study on with some friends. So if that's interest to you, send me a message on Instagram or send me an email. I'd love to know if you're interested. All right, so the second book that I'm going to be reading this summer, and if you could see it, it is way bigger than the first one I talked about, but it's called Fair Isn't Always Equal by Rick Wormeli. Now, something that's really cool is Rick Wormeli, as well as Eric Jensen, came and talked to our district and our school a few years ago. So I had some personal one-on-one experience with them, which I think is always super cool. Anyway, Fair Isn't Always Equal is a book about assessment and grading in a differentiated classroom. Now, I've read snippets of this book because our school, maybe 3 years ago now, made a huge switch from doing grades as an A, B, C, D, F to a 1, 2, 3, 4 and an NE. So we don't do zeros, we do NE, meaning there's not enough evidence. And with that shift, we started doing this thing called proficiency-based teaching and learning. And so this book talks about that and gives some insight into the thought process behind proficiency-based teaching and learning and why it can be more beneficial than just your quote-unquote standard classroom. So the reason why I wanted to read this book is, yes, my school does proficiency-based teaching and learning, but because of the things I want to implement in the fall with what I'll talk about for book 3, I feel like this coincides really nicely. So this book talks a lot about how students have real understanding and real learning, and how assessment should be a portrayal of that and not a gotcha of you didn't learn this well enough, now you get an F, and now you're going to flunk this class forever. But more so, it should be a reflection of what they have learned, and that's where I use the term celebration of learning in my classroom. I think I've talked about that before, but I don't necessarily call them tests, quizzes, sometimes assessments, but most of the time it's a celebration of learning, because anything that they've learned so far is worth celebrating. It means that your mind is growing and changing, and that is something that needs to be celebrated. So that is the reason why I wanted to read this book, is just to dive in deeper of how I can make that a reality for my students. So I'm going to read you the back cover, same as I did with the first book. Differentiated instruction is a nice idea, but what happens when it comes to assessing and grading students? What's both fair and leads to real student learning? An internationally recognized expert on grading practices, Rick Wormeli first examined these questions 10 years ago in the first edition of Fair Isn't Always Equal. In this thoroughly updated second edition, Rick provides a catalyst for serious reflection on current grading and assessment practices in differentiated classrooms. The book outlines coherent and effective standards-based grading practices for a high-stakes, accountability-focused world. Recognizing the importance of having a shared school vision for assessment and grading, Rick addresses the challenges for teachers and administrators alike. Educators from kindergarten to high school will find real examples and gray areas of grading. Rick tackles important and sometimes controversial assessment and grading issues constructively, incorporating modern pedagogy and the challenges of working with diverse groups of students. New sections address sports, eligibility, honor roll, descriptive feedback techniques, and gifted, talented students. Chapters on test questions, redos, retakes, grading scales, and grading efforts and behavior have been revised extensively. This important book clearly explains the principles behind best grading practices, so you are ready for all grading questions or realities that you may encounter in your classrooms and schools. I'm always extremely impressed about the wordage or the verbiage on the back of books. Like, that was some incredibly descriptive words within a short period of time. That is impressive. I need to take note on this and use this for my own business. Anyway, so that is Fair Isn't Always Equal by Rick Wormeli. It is definitely a longer read, but it does have some amazing things inside of it, as I've read previously. I am interrupting today's episode to talk to you about the Reignite the Math Classroom Conference. The special thing about this self-paced conference is that it is professional development for math teachers by math teachers. With 9 professional development topics plus 3 bonus presenters, this conference is something you will not want to miss. When you purchase your ticket, you will get access to an exclusive Facebook group with other Reignite the Math Classroom students. Inside this group, each of our presenters will go live to answer any questions you have regarding their sessions. July 7th is going to come faster than you think, so go ahead and purchase your ticket now so you can start the process of reigniting your math classroom. And finally, moving into our third book. You've heard me talk about this one before. I have had 2 or 3 podcast episodes dedicated to things I've learned from this. It's called Building Thinking Classrooms in Mathematics by Peter Liljedahl. Now, I started reading this book back in March, I think, maybe April. And I know I said I don't listen to educational book audiobooks, but this one was the exception, mostly because I had an Audible credit and I didn't want to buy the book online. But surprisingly enough, the audiobook, or I guess the way the book is written, is very narrative format rather than here's the research, here's the facts, here's the conclusions. So it's been quite pleasant to listen to. I stumbled across this book because I was researching how to help students understand the Pythagorean theorem without just giving them the formula. And I know there's plenty of ways to do that, but I wanted some lesson plan that would just tell me how to do it because it was near the end of the school year and I just needed that. When I came across this book, I realized that there was an entire Facebook group and following dedicated to the practices that are within Building Thinking Classrooms in Mathematics by Peter Liljedahl. And within that group, there are thousands of tasks that people have created that are dedicated to helping students understand the reason why behind the math and not just, here's the formula, now do it. Which kind of makes sense of why the book is more narrative than fact-driven. And of course, you know me, I like to dive headfirst into anything new that I find and I really like. So I did just that. I downloaded the book on Audible and I started listening to it. And I got 1 chapter in before I was like, oh, yep, I'm going to be doing everything that is in this book. And that is when I changed the setup of my classroom to be groups of 3. I ditched the seating chart and started doing visibly random groupings, and started to make the activities we were doing more project-based and more discovery-based than let's do some notes now, practice these problems based off what we learned in our notes. And I have absolutely loved it. And so I read through chapter 2 and 3, and I think I got to chapter 4, but then, end of the school year, lots of things happening, and I haven't picked it up since. So that is why it is on my summer reading list, because if the 3 things I've learned so far have made me change everything in my classroom, then the rest of the book has got to be pretty dang good. So that is why it's on my reading list, and I'm excited to share more as I go through the book. Now, I can't exactly read you the back of the book, seeing as I have the Audible version or the audiobook version, but I'll read you the summary that they have. A thinking student is an engaged student. Teachers often find it difficult to implement lessons that help students go beyond rote memorization and repetitive calculations. In fact, institutional norms and habits that permeate all classrooms can actually be enabling non-thinking student behavior. Sparked by observing teachers struggle to implement rich mathematic tasks to engage students in deep thinking, Peter Liljedahl has translated his 15 years of research into this practical guide on how to move toward a thinking classroom. Building Thinking Classrooms in Mathematics grades K through 12 helps teachers implement 14 optimal practices for thinking that create an ideal setting for deep mathematics learning to occur. This guide, 1, provides the what, why, and how of each practice and answers teachers' most frequently asked questions. 2, includes first-hand accounts of how these practices foster thinking through teacher and student interviews and student work samples. 3. Offers a plethora of macro moves, micro moves, and rich tasks to get started. And 4. Organizes the 14 practices into 4 toolkits that can be implemented in order or built on throughout the school year. When combined, these unique research-based practices create the optimal conditions for learner-centered, student-owned, deep mathematical thinking and learning, and have the power to transform mathematics classrooms like never before. Dun dun dun. I feel like that part needed to be added. Anyway, as you can hear throughout that description, it's very on point with what I love about teaching math. Is I want it to be a student-centered classroom where students are deeply understanding the math and learning to love it. Because that, my friend, is how we change the world's view on math. In conclusion, the 3 teacher books that I am reading this summer is 1. Teaching with Poverty in Mind by Eric Jensen, 2. Fair Isn't Always Equal by Rick Wormeli, and 3. Building Thinking Classrooms in Mathematics by Peter Liljedahl. I will definitely keep you updated as I read through these books. Definitely check out my Instagram stories because that is where I will do most of the updating, as well as inside my group, A Fraction of Math Teachers. If you haven't joined A Fraction of Math Teachers Facebook group yet, please do so. I would love to have you in a community with me where I can have a two-way conversation with you instead of just this podcast where I get to talk at you. So I'd love for you to join. I'll put a link in the description as well as the show notes on my website. Please join, and I will share all the updates as I go through these books. And with that, I'll calculator. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. To find all the links and resources to things talked about in this episode, head on over to MissKuipersClassroom.com and click on podcast.